Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today in our eternal quest to get all of the best and brightest of North Dakota on the podcast is Daryl Ritchison, who is the director of the North Dakota Agricultural Weather Network at NDSU. We look around the world here to think about what weather is going to look like in the year ahead. As I said to Daryl on the podcast, weather always affects geopolitics very deeply, especially agriculture, but I'm not sure that it's ever been as important as it is right now, especially with all of the disruptions in agricultural supply chains the world over. So it was really great to get his perspective on the podcast and super appreciate him making the time. We recorded this on Wednesday, November the 2nd. This will come out in about a week and a half. So we were talking mostly about the next 9 to 12 months, but if anything crazy weather-wise happens in the next week and a half and we don't mention it, that's why. Otherwise, not a whole lot of housekeeping notes from me. As usual, you can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have questions about the podcast or you want to hear more about what Cognitive Investments does. Also, please consider leaving a rating or review on the podcast if you like it and share it with your friends. We have surpassed the sort of 1,000 downloads per episode milestone, which is really, really great. And it's a testament to all of you sharing this podcast. I really appreciate that. And enough talking for me. Let's get to the conversation with Daryl. I hope you're all doing well. Cheers. Take care. Stay healthy. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Well, Daryl, thank you so much for taking the time. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Looking forward to the conversation.
I don't know. Well, I've been doing geopolitics now for over a decade. I'm not sure that weather has ever mattered so much to geopolitics as it does this year. I mean, it sort of always matters in the background. I cut my teeth on the Fukushima disaster, which of course started with a weather event. But I thought before we kind of dive into what's going on in the world and things like that, I thought I might just ask you some simple, maybe even veering on two simple questions about how you analyze weather and how you think about these things kind of broadly. And I thought the first question I would just start with is, how confident do you get? Like, what is the degree of confidence that you have in your forecast? Are there certain things you can say with more certainty when it comes to weather and certain things you can't? Like, as we have this conversation, how should people benchmark your certainty on some of the things we're going to talk about?
Of course, it really deals with time frame. I tend not to deal with the next 10 days. I speak regionally, nationally, a little bit internationally, because people want to know what's going on 3 to 12 months from now. I've already given a few talks, and I'm going to be giving a lot of them about dealing with the 2023 growing season. I always tell people, I do not know the future. I'm just crazy enough to predict it. And so if you're looking at a forecast from the TV news in the next several days, yeah, the confidence is pretty high. It might not be perfect, but it's pretty close. My goal is to give the generalities correctly. My forecast for 2022, and again, no one has to believe me because you didn't hear the forecast, for especially the upper Midwest, was for a warmer and drier than average summer. Again, like 2021. And that's what occurred. I'm reasonably confident when I make these forecasts, but there's always caveats in there. I've been on what I would describe as a pretty good hot streak now. I've gotten the last few years really, really well. But I always tell people I am just absolutely due for a complete and utter bust. It happens in this business. But I've been doing weather for over 30 years. I do believe this is my 35th year. And I always tell people, I do not expect to be perfect. I do expect to be useful. And that's always my goal, is to be useful. So I don't know if that really answers the question so much. But again, there's a high confidence in the next 3 or 4 days. But I don't really deal with that much anymore. I deal more with long range, and in some ways, what you do, in a way, is dealing and making those predictions. But there's a lot of clues and hints out there that help. And hanging on my wall, right behind this monitor that I'm looking at, I have a sign that says you don't get points for predicting rain. You get points for building arcs. And that's always what I'm trying to do. Looking outside and the sky is dark and saying, hey, it's going to rain, that's easy. But it takes a lot of research, a lot of time to try to make those more long-range seasonal forecasts that can be very, very useful for economic benefits.
And what I'm conscious also, if somebody asked me the question I'm about to ask you, I might get a little annoyed at it because it's too broad, but I'm going to do it anyway. What are I assume that the variables that you want to use for different forecasts in different regions are also going to vary. But what are some of the key variables that you are always watching to sort of craft some of these longer term forecasts?
A lot of times, I always remind people that the planet is 70% water. Almost all of the heat capacity of the planet is in the water, not the atmosphere. And I always remind people, it takes forever to boil water. And I speak to a lot of farm groups, so I always make the jokes. We all know how long it takes for us to make the macaroni and cheese or the hot dogs when our wives are gone type stuff. I know my audiences. And how long it cools it down. So I do spend a lot of time looking at changes in oceanic sea surface temperature anomalies, for example, but also blocking patterns around the globe. Really, say not necessarily the jet stream, but just levels just below the jet stream. And I've been doing this so long that you just see certain things occur and go, oh, this is going to happen. And it's going to take time, but 2 or 3 weeks from now, this is the scenario I see from experience. So I don't know if experience is a good answer for your audience, but after doing this for over 3 decades, I just get strong gut feelings a lot. And sometimes I just go, nah, I don't. I talk to myself, Daryl, I don't know. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And then, 3 weeks later, that's exactly what happened. I go, Daryl, trust your gut. You've seen this before. Trust it going on. But, really say looking at mid-level winds around the globe, looking for blocking patterns, oceanic temperatures. I'm just a weather nerd. I've liked weather since I'm 5. I'm 60 now. And after 55 years, I still just get absolutely fascinated with the weather. And it just never goes away with me, my fascination for the weather and looking. And so that helps me a lot because I just spend so much time that you notice things. But, it's stuff that happens in the Indian Ocean may impact North America in 3 weeks, type stuff. And so those are the things that you're looking for when you're doing the long-term forecast.
Yeah, there was definitely a version of my life where I would have become a meteorologist. I still annoy my wife by telling her what kinds of cloud formations I'm seeing in the sky and what that means for rain a day or two. And she always rolls her eyes, and I'm usually right. So thanks, sweetheart, if you're listening, for always doubting me. Let me ask you one more kind of broader question before we get down into brass tacks, which is, how often have you just been sort of slack-jaw surprised, or something was just completely, it wasn't there, you didn't see it coming, and it just completely surprised you? Does that happen often? And what was the last time it happened, if it does happen?
People are going to say that no way is he telling the truth. But I'm going to flat out say I never get surprised by the weather.
Cool.
The weather, again, the atmosphere is a nonlinear, chaotic system. You expect the unexpected. And so I just really don't get surprised. I might go, wow, I didn't see that coming because I missed the forecast. But I'm not surprised that I missed the forecast. I usually I should have known that was coming. And again, I have been asked that question in many talks, and I know people don't believe me when I say that, but the weather doesn't surprise me because, again, it's a nonlinear, chaotic system, and the unexpected is what you should be expecting.
Well, that might just be the title of the podcast, but it's also a good way to kind of dive in. So help situate us where we are today. So we've had a double dip La Nina. Maybe describe for the listeners who aren't looking at this stuff as nerdily as you and I are, what is La Nina? How rare is this sort of 3 in a row La Nina that we've got coming on? And how do you see that impacting, or do you see the triple dip La Nina coming? Are you beginning? I saw that, I forget which state meteorological agency came out and said, oh, maybe by January, February, we're going to go neutral. So I'll just lob up that softball and let you riff.
Well, to me, it's too late to say that it's not a triple dip La Nina, because even though if it technically fades away in February, it was still another La Nina. And you also have to remember this whole concept of La Nina and El Nino, the exact opposite, are based on 3-month averages. And so it doesn't go away in a day, technically. It's a 3-month average. So, but briefly to describe, a La Nina is the cooling of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. Generally, that cooling is created by atmospheric winds. And so you get very strong trade winds. And of course, along the between 30 degrees north and south, the winds generally blow from, say, east to west. And in the mid-latitudes, where a lot of us live, the general wind flows from west to east, as most people know. And so when La Ninas occur, you get that stronger flow. And so the cold water current along the west coast of South America, all that cold water kind of floats across the equatorial Pacific and goes into the western Pacific and then gradually fades away. El Ninos tend to be the exact opposite. It's the warming of the equatorial Pacific because the trade winds tend to fade away, and in turn, all the warmth of the western Pacific will flow across the equatorial Pacific and warm up the waters. As I've already alluded to, the heat capacity is all in the water, is that where is most of the surface area of the planet? We're round, so we're closer to the equator. So there's far more surface area between 0 and 10 degrees north than there is between 80 and 90 degree north, or even 70 and 90 degree north. So when you warm up that huge body of water, even 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, say 3 degrees Fahrenheit for imperial unit folks, wow, that's a lot of energy. And so that has to go someplace. Or with a La Nina, some of that energy, say, gets taken away. It has global impacts, and the impacts are a little bit different every time. One thing I'll probably just say it right off the bat and get it over with. I'm not an X equals Y person. All the time, well, there's a La Nina, so this is going to happen. And I go, whoa. I can show you multiple examples of La Ninas where that didn't happen. It's one variable of many. So it's not X equals Y. You have to look at other things also. Is La Nina globally right now the number one influence? Probably. But again, it's not the only influence. But again, that's at least technically El Nino Southern Oscillation. ENSO is what it's referenced to, this flip-flop back and forth. 101 for all your listeners.
Yeah. Well, since I'm controlling the questions here, I'll ask a selfish question, which is, last we were supposed to have another above average hurricane season here in the Gulf last year, and with apologies to those of you in Florida that are listening, like it wasn't so bad compared to the previous year in terms of numbers or some of the storms that hit the United States. And I was wondering why. I heard at some point that some Saharan dust cloud was preventing storms from forming in the Atlantic, and that made me think, well, we can make snow and have ski resorts inside malls in Dubai. We can't pump some African sand into the atmosphere and prevent hurricanes going forward. So tell me, maybe use that example to tell us what are some other variables that you might be looking at going forward to think about the next year in the United States.
Well, this past year, I'm not asked a lot about tropical stuff because I'm a meteorologist in North Dakota. Mm-hmm. My specialty truly is agriculture. That's, people bring me in for that. I get brought into other venues because people have heard of me or want me to talk about certain things. But, when I see forecasts and I don't see it being that active, but it only takes one storm. 1992 was not very active. But there was the one storm, Andrew. In some ways, this year wasn't that hyperactive that a lot of people thought that were in the forecast, but we had Ian, and it would always be remembered for that. Was the Sierra dust part of the equation? Probably. Sea surface temperature anomalies were not as warm as they had been in the previous year. There's a little bit more shear, and just think of shear as something that's just going to rip something apart, like you're going to rip a piece of paper, just going to shear it open. And so part of that, I think, dealt with this concept called the QBO, which is the quasi-biennial oscillation, which is stratospheric, but it still has, and stratosphere is the layer of the atmosphere above the troposphere where all of our weather occurs. That flip-flop from an east to west to a west to east, and that's a whole concept in of itself. But when I looked at everything, I just thought, all these factors coming together, I bet it's a fairly average year, which it was. Going forward, they're very likely not going to be a La Nina in 2023. Why do La Ninas increase the number of hurricanes potentially is because there usually isn't that shear. They say there isn't that west to east wind in the tropics as all these storms are trying to move east to west. And La Nina is because the whole flow tends to be more in the Pacific Ocean, say from the east to the west. It just kind of balances what's happening in the Atlantic Ocean. When there's an El Nino, you tend to get that west-east flow going back into the Atlantic and kind of rip the storms apart before they really get started. Next year, I don't think there will be an El Nino in the summer, but it'll be more neutral. But I think that will probably suppress the number, so we might have another average year. And if we're going to look even farther ahead in 2024, I would bet the odds are pretty good that there will be an El Nino, a warming of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. So in 2024, probably, again, not a super active year. And eventually, Jacob, this is going to be a whole other conversation in a way, but there's this concept in the Atlantic Ocean called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. Bill Gray, famous for his hurricane prediction numbers from Colorado State. So many folks have heard of Bill Gray. In the mid-90s said, the next 20, 30 years be very active because the Atlantic Ocean has gone into its warm phase. And so the Atlantic waters are a little bit warmer. Therefore, we're probably going to have an increase in hurricanes. Nailed it. Well, guess what? That's called an Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation for a reason. Decades in there, multi. Probably sometime this decade, we're due for the Atlantic Ocean to flip and be colder than average, which in turn might be a 15, 20-year period where there's not quite so many hurricanes. And so you might, if I had a chart, you're up here, then you go down here for 20 years, you go back up here for 20 years. Again, weather's non-linear, but there are some trends going back and forth. So going forward, we might actually become less active as we move through the 20s and the 30s than say we were in the 90s through, the 20 teens, for an example.
Well, I mean, from your lips to God's ears, for those of us sitting here in New Orleans, always wondering about this all the time, recognizing that you're not a climatologist, and before we get to the bread and butter of what you focus on with the U.S. And agriculture. So when I see a map or when I turn on Margaret Orr down here in New Orleans and watch the weather, and she shows me all these ridiculously high water temperatures in the Gulf and in the Atlantic and things like that. How much of that should we ascribe to things like climate change, just the warming of the planet in general, versus no, it's actually really determined by these oscillations and things that you're talking about here?
I would say a vast majority of dealing with oscillations, and it just comes down to the weather. Because we have a very short period of records of actual sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you can look at that, yeah, it's really warm, but there are other warming periods. There's some evidence from ship records and stuff that we've had other warming periods there. Can I attribute absolutely nothing to humans? No, of course not. But you can't forget about natural variations, because natural variations are extremely important and are still there. And I would equate, a vast majority to the warming of the Gulf of Mexico to that influence, because it also deals with the Atlantic Ocean. For instance, Europe has had a period now of about 20, 25 years of, more winters than not being average or above. Well, the Atlantic Ocean is warmer than average. That's where most of their weather is coming from. That's expected. I use the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation to forecast autumns in the upper Midwest. When the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation is in its positive phase, like it is right now, we tend to have warmer and drier than average autumns here, like this one. 2 years ago, we're huge sugar beet producers here in the Red River Valley, where I'm talking from in Fargo, North Dakota. And they will call me a lot because they need to get their beets out of the ground. They like certain temperatures. They have to be stored in the winter. They can't really harvest them when it's too warm. Of course, the Red River Valley is great agricultural. It's an old lake bed, so it's mainly clay. You put a little rain on it, and it becomes a slime pit. And in 19, they asked me, "Hey, Daryl, we're going to have another warm autumn and a warm, dry autumn." And I said, "I really don't think so. I think it's going to be cooler and wet." And they go, "Why?" Well, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation has briefly switched negative. I don't think it's going to stay this way, but I think it's going to be a little tougher harvest and a tougher fall for you. It was one of our wettest, most awful fall harvests ever. And so after a while, they came to me and go, "Well, geez, Daryl, when you're talking wet, you never said we're going to be this wet." And I go, "Well, I'm not that good." I got the general trend, but that was a long range forecast that was reasonably and usefully accurate based on that. And so you can go back in time. I say this in a lot of my talks, and I'm sure it makes some people roll their eyes. I look at things in 1,000-year period, not the next 2 days. I look back, we have proxy data, we have all this other stuff. So we only have 130, 40 years of good records. And even that, I would question how good those records were. But you have to go back to proxy data and see what's happened in the past and try to equate it with what's happening now to try to project forward, say, the next 3 or 12 months in a forecast, what the general trends are going to be.
Well, it sounds like Vladimir Putin should have thought about the multi-decade Atlantic oscillation before he decided to invade Ukraine and put all of his strategy on leveraging energy costs over Europe. Because you mentioned Europe, we might just stick on that a little bit before we turn away from it, because they've had record warm temperatures here last month, and it looks like another extremely mild November. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that Europe in general is in this kind of warming period, and that maybe towards the end of the decade should be expecting cooler temperatures. Because I've actually that data you're talking about heating and cooling degree days, I've used that a couple times in recent presentations, telling people that like this energy crisis in Europe might be a little exaggerated, because if you look at the last 20, 30 years, it's only 3 or 4 years where Europe's been colder kind of than average. Things seem to be warming, but it sounds like what you're telling me is that Europe's kind of at the end of that gravy train, and it's good that they're having this energy crisis now, not 5 years from now. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say it's fair, but you have to remember that, there's no perfect correlations in weather. People try to make them, but they've had cold winters in this period and they had warm winters. But if you go back and look at the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation and temperatures in Europe, you'll notice they somewhat match. The thing is, temperatures today are so contaminated by urban heat islands and land use changes that you have to, somewhat take that into effect, try to do some estimates a little bit when you do that. But there is at least some correlation with that. There certainly is with Atlantic hurricanes. And to me, I see it with European weather as well. I was asked on, I think you were actually on that call I had heard when I was doing European weather. And I said, there's these reasons why I really think it's going to be colder than average, but they have this, and this. So I think it's going to balance out to be a little bit more average, but they're going to have cold snaps. You also have to remember Europe is highly dependent in some ways, more so than the United States, in renewable energy. And so even if it's warmer than average, if high pressure is causing it and the surface winds are light, all those wind turbines aren't turning. So you can still have problems with the weather, even if it's not the coldest winter ever, when you don't, have those reserves. But again, you rarely, I shouldn't say never, but you rarely have an extended period of, say, the next 4 months where it's always above average. There's always those periods where you have colder than average. And it's just, how does that balance out? I think, my current forecast is for them to finish above average overall, but there's going to be some cold periods, and they're very, very likely, because that's, again, just how the weather works.
Well, yeah, and a good example of that is I was in Dublin a couple weeks ago for a speaking event, and the day I got there, my flight was delayed 4 hours because massive, severe thunderstorms, like cracking thunder and lightning. And when I actually landed, the Irish that I met were like, "This is crazy. This absolutely never happens in Ireland." And lightning had struck some of the wind turbines too. So they were worried that some of the wind turbines were going to go out of commission. So to your point, just kind of random things can happen. What is your forecast for Europe from an agriculture crop perspective? Because it's been a rough year, especially I'm thinking of France and things like that. But how are you thinking about agriculture in Europe for weather in the year ahead?
I think where they grow winter wheat, it's a very, very tough start, clearly. I do think 2023 is going to be anything like 2022. I think it's going to be a much, much better year. So much of what happens in Europe in some ways deals with the North Atlantic Oscillation besides the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, throwing acronyms all over the place for everyone listening to that. And the North Atlantic Oscillation is really tricky to forecast. Where is that going to really set up and going forward? But I think much of this winter is going to be in its positive phase, which tends to bring the Mediterranean to be a little bit on the dry side. Northern area is a little bit wet, but the wetness equates, to keeping it a little bit warmer because there's clouds. You don't get the Arctic influence. You don't get the Siberian air coming through Russia into Europe quite as often. But that will, I think, areas that plant winter wheat, for example, be tough. But again, to me, what's happening in the Atlantic and some other changes will next 2023 be a perfect agricultural year? Of course not. It never works that way, but much, much improved over what they had this year, especially in France, which is in so many ways, so very crucial to European, especially wheat production and other things there too. That you just, again, to me, sometimes it's just playing with statistics. When do you ever get 2 years like that in a row in any latitudinal location? It's very, very unusual. So sometimes you can just play statistics with it, but there's other factors involved that give me a much more positive outlook than what occurred this year.
Cool. Well, let's turn to the United States. Tell us what you're thinking about for U.S. This year. It was kind of it seemed like it started rough in the Great Plains and around where you are. I know down in Texas, where I lived for a long time, it was pretty rough in West Texas and for cotton in general. So just give us kind of the broad view of what you're thinking about for the U.S.
Well, for the winter, I'm probably the odd man out on this one. It's a La Nina, so X equals Y. So the Southern Plains, it's going to have this very dry winter. It's going to be really tough for the winter wheat belt, for example. I'm not in that camp. I gave in my last talk dealing with that, still looked over it. They've gotten some pretty good rains in the eastern part of the winter wheat belt recently. There's another system coming that I think will, in so many ways, you only really need one good rain. You'll get it going into dormancy. And then as we go into next spring, the thing is, I always say this, I understand why you don't like severe weather. Don't get me wrong. Severe weather at the same time brings most of the rain to the plains. And so you get the news, there was 17 tornadoes reported, all this damage occurred, someone may have died. That's incredibly sad. That's awful. But yet 90% of the area got an incredibly awesome rain, and it was good news. But it comes with severe weather. I oftentimes ask, you think next year is going to be a busy severe weather season? Well, my forecast is for it to be dry. So the answer is no, because one equates to the other, because we get it. But I really think they'll do better in the Southern Plains this winter than most of the other forecasts. I think some of the things that have been happening already allude to that. And I think next year's severe weather season, as we fade away that La Nina, again, X doesn't equal Y, but you fade away that La Nina and what's happening in the North Pacific, I really think the severe weather season next year will be reasonably active, which is bad in the sense of more tornadoes, more damage, but good in the sense of getting that many of the areas, the soil moisture that they need for, say, the cotton crop, get that winter wheat crop coming out of dormancy and having a much better year than they had last year, for example. So that's really my thoughts in the Southern Plains, which is, again, I think is opposite from almost what everyone else is saying. Because I always get, when you're a meteorologist, you probably get it too in your line of work, is, well, this person is saying this, why aren't you saying that? And I'm going, well, we look at things differently, and I'm only as good as my last forecast going forward. But I go, I don't listen to other people do the weather because it kind of messes with my brain. I just, this is just my forecast. Take it for what it's worth going forward. In the Northern Plains, let me explain this to you. There again, it cycles in many ways. The last 25, 30 years across much of the upper Midwest has been noticeably wet. The last time it was that wet was back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Then it was mostly on the drier side, and then we had this wet cycle. I've been telling people for 20 years, wait till we get to the 2020s. We're going to dry off again. But in the sense is we're just going to go back to that 20th century average. We still did agriculture, but we're going to lose it. You can take from Bismarck, Sioux Falls, Minneapolis, Des Moines, Springfield, Missouri, Indianapolis, Indiana, all of those cities. Generally speaking, if you take their current average, and again, folks, average, if you don't know what it's based on, is the last 30 years and whole decades. So in 2021, on January 1st, boom, the averages switched. It's the start of a new decade. So our current averages are based on 1991 to 2020. And we won't change our averages again until January 1st of 2031. You take all those major agricultural areas that I just mentioned, 70, it depends on the spot, but generally speaking, 70% of the years historically have been drier than the current 30-year average. In turn, if you're making a forecast for wet or dry, what are you going to say? If you're in Las Vegas with a 70% chance of winning, are you ever leaving Las Vegas?
Probably not.
All I'm saying is, if someone will say to me, well, Daryl, climate change, it's just going to get wetter and wetter. And I go, no, that's just too simplistic of an answer. It just, again, the weather is a nonlinear chaotic system. And there are natural variations out there. And please don't email me and tell me I'm a climate denier, folks. Come on. There's other things going on. And so I just think, I think we're just going to go back to that 20th century average. So all these places will just get, say, 10 or 15% less rain in the summer. But that's the long-term average. That doesn't mean it's dry. People will think it's dry. But I think that's what's going to happen to us in the 2020, that we're going to see more quote-unquote drier years than wetter years. But if you look at the long-term average, it's not so dry if you're taking a 100-year average. It is dry if you take that 30-year average, which was why I always ask people, what does the word dry or drought really mean? Because there's just not a black and white answer there. What you consider dry in New Orleans would flood the Red River Valley where I live, and Lake Agassiz would come back, back and forth. And so it is a matter of perspective. But that's what I think the general trend as we go through this decade is going to be. It's just this little trend downward. But again, dry doesn't necessarily mean catastrophic cropping, that we can't get what we have been routinely used to. It's just going to be different.
What about the U.S. Southwest? I mean, there's been a lot of news about the Colorado River and about agriculture in the Southwest and how much of it is based on the river and how water levels are dropping faster than people predicted. Is there a reprieve at all in this for the Southwest, or is the situation as dire as at least the U.S. federal government is talking it up to be?
Well, did anyone hear how extremely wet it was this summer? They just had an awesome monsoonal season in the Southwest. But I don't hear that from anybody. The thing is, the Colorado River, if you look historically at the inputs coming out, it really hasn't changed. Hardly at all. You have a lot of people living in a desert that need water. The Colorado River was never designed to give water for that much agriculture, that many people. You cannot make that much snow. You can't have 300% of average snow in Colorado year after year after year after year to fill that back up. So it has more to do with life than just climate. Yeah. Because the inputs on the Colorado River have not changed that much. We're just taking out a lot of water out of the systems. So then it comes down to, how are humans going to change their land use changes to make up for that? Because that is, I think, as big, if not bigger, than just the fact that it's been extremely dry. Because if the next 3 or 4 winters are just extremely wet, the lake, like say Lake Mead still, that's a lot of acre feet. It's just going to be tough. We're just using more than that climate allows humans to use. Mm-hmm. And you would think with a modern civilization and our intelligence level that we would understand that. But there's so much infighting. I'm just glad I don't live out west. I visited Grand Tetons National Park, and of course the Idaho farmers own the top 23 feet of Jackson Lake, and they needed it last year, so just away that it went, because that's the law. And so then I go to the park, there's no water there. But again, it's a man-made structure, and we think just because we build a dam there, it's always going to stay the same or at the same level. We all have read our history, and we know what horrid droughts, the West has had. Even when I was in Grand Tetons National Park, I was very impressed with my tour guide. We took a tour of Jenny Lake in the park, and there's this ghost forest in the lake that's like 30 feet down, and he goes, that was likely caused because this area had this 300-year drought. So then the trees were able to grow that far down. And as the meteorologist, climatologist in the boat, I'm going, thank you, for saying, that, because it's true. I think there's so much evidence to support that take on that. And again, it's just an example of just how patterns change over, time and space. And there's some extremes that say modern humans have never experienced yet, and that we just have to maybe be smarter in our usage of things than we currently are sometimes.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But let's not dwell on that. How about our friends both in Canada and Mexico? And any thoughts on? We have a fair number of Canadians in the agricultural community listening to this podcast too. So why don't we start with our friends up north? Any thoughts for especially Western Canada and producers and farmers there this year?
Well, they did a little bit better this year. And again, it sounds arrogant, and I don't want to be, but it was in my forecast that they'd have a much better year. Some more water was going up there. The patterns were a little bit more favorable for rain for their, mainly spring wheat belt area where they grow spring wheat in. And I think even this winter and the next spring will also be favorable to try to get that soil moisture replenished in that area going forward. But it's a tough area to predict because it's on the lee side of the Rocky Mountains. Storms have to make a certain track to really be able to bring in that moisture up into that area. But I would equate that positivity and tag it with the whole thing that I just said about the 2020s and then probably into the 2030s generally being just a little bit lower. So when we get to 2031, our new rainfall averages are very likely going to be lower than our current averages, because overall this decade, not only in the upper Midwest, but the Great Plains into the prairie provinces of Canada will have more years with a little bit lesser rains. But I'm still at least somewhat what I'm looking at favorable that they'll have at least a crop, which they really in many ways didn't have in 2021. But they did this year, and I think that'd be the case going into 2023 too.
Cool. And what about to the south in Mexico? Any concerns for Mexican agriculture this year?
It's been a difficult patterns for them lately. I think that's the area where generally speaking, outside the mountainous areas, it's a drier climate anyway. I'm not, that's the one area where I can't spin it with a little positivity, to be honest.
So maybe thinking in terms of Mexico, because I saw that Mexico was, I think it was just this week, the government was talking about how they were going to not import genetically modified corn, and the AMLO government wants to boost corn yields in Mexico too. It wouldn't be the first time that the AMLO government has said one thing and then reality has crashed them in the face on the other side. But it sounds like you're saying a similar thing maybe for those types of rosy projections.
I would lean more towards that, and I understand what they're saying. And, I always tell people, I hope, when my forecasts are negative, I always tell people I'd be glad to be wrong. Yeah. I really would be, but I would not be surprised if that's the case once again.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's turn to South America. It seems to me like South America has borne the brunt of this 2 years of La Nina, especially Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay in general. I mean, the decline in and some soybean yields and wheat yields down there in the last couple of years pretty bad. I think Brazil has said this is the worst drought in their recorded history. To your point, we don't have millennia of data like you would like, but going back to as long as Brazil's been around, pretty terrible droughts. But then last couple of weeks, apparently to add insult to injury, it's too much rain. So now they're revising down soybean yield projections because we've got too much rain, even though we're still in La Nina. So it helps situate us in South America and what the picture looks like for the year ahead.
Well, the biggest dry problems have really been far southern, more Brazil, Parana province, and then down through Argentina has just really had it tough. Again, X doesn't equal Y, but Argentina does have the biggest influence with La Nina, even more so than Brazil. And of course, what does dryness equate to is also bigger ranges in temperature. Drier heats up faster, cools down faster. So what happened in Argentina in the last few days? A late season frost and freeze that added. So they had to do some replanting there. The last talk I gave down there, I said, I know this is going to sound odd, but I really think, especially in the northern areas like Mato Grosso, which is the biggest area for soybeans and also the then second season corn, the safrinha corn crop. I know everyone's talking dry. I just think they're going to have flooding and have problems there. And so when the wetness came in the last week, I had several people go, "Wow, Daryl, you just nailed that." And I go, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. It's one storm. It's a long growing season, So, the positive is they got the rain. They get to go started. But now if you look, probably the next week to 10 days, because they're still not fully planted yet, looks great for planting. So they'll probably get their crop in, maybe a little bit delayed and move forward. But I think, say, Parana, the southern parts of Brazil, Argentina, I still have down as another tough year. But the northern areas, I think if they have any problems, it might be too wet instead. So even if I'm close, a lot of people have asked me, I go, the USDA has been really optimistic on their yields and crops at the beginnings of seasons. And, they have, Brazil's record crops. And I go, I'm not saying it's going to be a horrible crop. I'm just saying, let's temper that down a little bit. I think there's going to be enough problems that extremely optimistic forecast for crop yields and production totals just seems high to me. And I think some of the things going on just in the last 3 weeks tend to give me a little bit more confidence in what I'm saying there is going to come true. And, and we'll also, this is way outside of my wheelhouse, as they say, but the election that just happened, how is that going to influence the overall crop? Not the growing of it, of course, but exporting and, production and things too is another big question mark down there that I just said I'm just not as optimistic as a lot of people are, is how I usually word it.
Yeah, the one thing about yields in Brazil is that, Brazil is planting more and more acres or hectares or whatever, measurement we want to use there. So even if they're getting lower yields due to bad weather, they also are just planting so much more and they're so gung-ho about it. But then fertilizer gets involved and then we're kind of, we're kind of off to the races. Any other thoughts on Latin America before we move over to Asia?
No, I think that's pretty much sums up my thoughts.
Okay. Well, let me pick your brain about something I was reading just before we got on the podcast here, which I've been reading about, the terrible drought in some of China's main growing regions this year, and different reports from Chinese agricultural agencies of yields marked way down, and temperatures are super high, and there's just no rain at all, and highest levels of concern, blah blah blah. Global Times comes out today and says, no, actually, due to the great intervention of the Chinese Communist Party, everything's going well. We've got 90% kind of harvested. Everything's going well. For me, alarm bells are going off. I'm starting to think like late 1950s. Maybe Xi doesn't know what's going on. Maybe people are afraid of telling them kind of what the yields are in general. But help situate us with the weather in China this year, because we obviously can't trust the data coming out of China, but maybe we can trust the weather and work our way backwards from that.
In one of my talks that I give on global economics dealing with weather patterns and supply chains type talk I give, I always remind people of the obvious. You just cannot overemphasize the importance of the monsoon in Asia. because of the population base. It is just it's probably the most important weather feature on the globe. And La Nina does have that impact. And then there's other thing that deals with this Indian dipole, how circulation patterns over the Indian Ocean from Australia to India, but that impacts the monsoon, which impacts China going forward. The thing is that Indian dipole situation, I don't know if that necessarily, and I won't go into details, will go away, but the La Nina fading, which is another component, which again, it's not an X equal Y, but I think it's the most dominant one of several factors that are going on, will be changing in 2023. So in turn, they're not going to be able to magically catch up, and even with perfect yield, but 2023 in China, the dryness or yield problems that they had should get better in 2023 with that fading and as we go into neutral. And I hate to say this again, but what would solve a lot of their big moisture problems would be a typhoon, hurt their way. And they really, everyone, like 2022, wow, what an active hurricane season. Yeah, in the Atlantic, globally, it was way down.
Mm-hmm.
And again, yeah, you'll read in the news, there's this X or Y typhoon there, but really their typhoon numbers have been down. Well, that's a huge amount of moisture. It does bad things, but it's a very important, in some ways, it is and isn't, part of the monsoonal flow. But with La Nina fading and this 3-year La Nina, and you had asked me and I never answered, how rare or unusual it is. The last time it occurred was 20 years ago. And looking back, it seems to me to be approximately a 20-25 year event. So, I wouldn't expect it maybe again until 2040 to get 3, we'll certainly have La Ninas between them, but to get 3 in a row is a little bit unusual. So that will fix itself. Plus this whole QBO thing, switching also is favorable for getting more rain into Asia as well from my research and what I've looked in. Someone else that might be listening to this will write me and go, well, Daryl, no, blah, blah, blah. And I understand. I would completely understand their side of the story. But from, my research, what I'm looking at, I think will be a positive influence as well for China in particular, but really in many ways, all of Eastern Asia.
So maybe a better year for China ahead, but is it fair to say that China had a pretty bad year the past 12 months?
All the data I've seen would suggest that to be true.
Okay.
But I'm not looking at data from the Chinese government. It's satellite data, other sources that you can get for what's occurred there. It was tough. There's no, to me, denying that. It was just dry and tough. Yeah.
Moving a little bit more to the interior, you mentioned the Indian dipole. I mean, the catastrophic flooding in Pakistan this year, to a lesser extent, India is probably one of the big stories of the year. Certainly in Asia, it's one of the big stories of the year. Is that related to that Indian dipole, or are they going to get maybe a reprieve next year? I know that the monsoon is one of the things that really does get affected by climate change and human activity.
Well, I would say that Indian dipole had an influence. Was it the only influence? Again, no, there's always more than one influence. But if you throw that, but even La Nina in the Pacific has global implications, again, is one of those factors going forward. And so, again, 2023, probably better. But then I would always flip it and go, but now should we not be concerned with dry? There's an old English proverb, so it's from England, Great Britain, but it really works globally, and the old saying goes, there is no debt so surely met as wet to dry and dry to wet. And it's just, and that proverb is hundreds of years old. So again, we know this back and forth has gone on for really forever. So then I always flip it around and just going, okay, yeah, I understand that, but what I'm seeing, I now wonder about the dry problems in 23, 24, rather than continued with the wet problems, because you get this opposite effect very rapidly as the patterns just flip-flop in a way 180 degrees. Yeah. So from my perspective, I'd be worried about a little dryness over a little wetness going forward.
Okay. Before I let you go, what haven't I asked that I should have asked, or what do you want listeners to take home that I haven't focused on enough?
That question sometimes scares me. All I will say is, and please don't write me, I am not a climate change denier, people, but I'm also a realist in that natural variability, land use changes, these are also influences going forward. And when you hear things, remember there's always more to that story. It's just not so easy. Those are the easy headlines. Those are sometimes, and I used to work in the media, so I'm not picking on the media, but, hey, everything went great in the world today doesn't give them ad revenue, sometimes. So always remember that what you're hearing is, please do a little bit more research, look more into what's going on. And this is not the first time that this happened. I've been doing this for 35 years. Nothing in the last 35 years can I not find an example of it happening in the past. So you can't, just because this happened, it's climate change. No, it is way, way more complicated than that. These things happened in the past. And so I'm pleased, because I get these people and I have these conversations, just, I don't know, they don't have a life and will throw things at me. It's just that there is more out there, and don't listen to always the easy answer. There are other explanations out there, I guess, is what I would really like to say, just in the sense of education, that just go do your own research, look over things, and understand that just because there's bad flooding here, you just can't throw the climate change word at everything, because it's just not true. Well, some of it might probably is, but not all of it.
Well, don't worry. I wouldn't worry about any hate mail from this audience. We've cultivated an audience of folks who are trying to think differently, and that's one of the reasons we were so happy to have you on. Daryl, I hope you'll come back in maybe 6 months' time, and we can check in on how you did, and maybe picking up and going into the next year if you're willing.
And that would be wonderful. And I have heard that you're going to be in Minot, North Dakota.
I will.
In January.
Yeah, they brought me up to Fargo in September to show me how great it is. And I guess they wanted me to see the other side of North Dakota in January.
So I'm trying to fiddle with my schedule to see if I can get up there. But I will do my best to see if I can bring you above average temperatures at least. So it'd be in the 20s when you're here.
I don't need
because sadly 20s is above average.
I don't need above average. I've already told my host there that I want to go ice fishing, and I expect I want the full treatment. I'll also be in.
Oh, you can go ice fishing in the 20s. Just saying, ice still freezes.
All right.
But have you ever experienced, say, 20 below Fahrenheit?
20 below. I'm trying to think. I lived in upstate New York for a couple years, but I think the lowest it ever got was like 5 below, I think was the lowest it ever got. I don't think I've ever been in anything colder than 5 below. I was in Moscow twice in December, but both times it was a balmy, like 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So I kind of lucked out there.
Experiencing 20, 25 below, and granted, it gets colder in other spots in the world, and even here occasionally, is just an awesome sensation to you. I mean, it really is. 5 below is annoying to me. 25 below all of a sudden just becomes, wow, this is just like, it's awesome how the air is still, how dense the atmosphere is, how well sound travels. It's all these things. So I hope you get a chance to experience that.
I guess I hope so too. It would certainly be a nice vacation from the 95 degrees and 100% humidity we have for 3 months out of the year down here. So,
all right. But thanks so much for having me on.
Cheers, Daryl. Thanks so much. We'll have you on soon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.